Welcome. This is our second event in our Unlocking Cooperation series. My name is Joel Rosenthal, and I have the privilege of serving as president of this organization, the Carnegie Council for Ethics and International Affairs. Our topic this evening is climate change and human mobility. Two themes frequently discussed here at Carnegie Council, but until recently, these two themes were not often discussed together. Today is a particularly apt time for this conversation. On the UN calendar, today is World Refugee Day, a moment designated by the United Nations to recognize refugees around the globe. It was first held in 2001 to mark the 50th anniversary of the 1951 Convention on the Status of Refugees. On the Carnegie Council calendar, today also marks the beginning of the 5th meeting of our Carnegie Ethics Fellows. So welcome to all those fellows out there. Thanks for coming. As I mentioned when we convened the first event in this series, at Carnegie Council, we believe that unlocking is precisely the right term we need to help us in the search for new forms of international cooperation. Unlocking suggests that success is within reach if we can find and foster the values and interests that we share by virtue of being human. Carnegie Council has been working on the challenges of human mobility for some time now. You will see our latest work within the Model International Mobility Convention, we call it MIMC, available in hard copy for those of you here in the room and online for those of you watching virtually. This coming fall, under the leadership of Senior Fellow Michael Doyle, the convention will undergo a third revision, which will include a special focus on addressing the challenge of climate-induced mobility. As the Council embarks on developing the next version of the convention, we invite our community, including everyone here today, to engage with us in this effort. As part of this work, the Carnegie Council will seek to consider the distinctly ethical issues arising out of the intersection of human mobility and climate change. Among those issues are a recognition that it is refugees and internally displaced people, the stateless and the powerless, that are at the forefront of the climate emergency. In understanding that those who are being displaced are often the ones who did the least to contribute to climate change. And that climate change is not only driving displacement, it also makes life much harder for those already forced to flee, who often find themselves in climate vulnerable areas. As climate change worsens, so will its impact as a driver of displacement. It is clear and irrefutable that greater global cooperation on this issue is essential. And that is why we're here this evening, to explore how we might forge this much-needed cooperative approach. Thanks to Kevin Maloney, our Director of Communications here at the Council, we have assembled an excellent panel of experts who have great insight and experience from across the UN system to share with us. We also have the expert moderation and inspiration of our good friend Ramu Damodaran, Senior Advisor to the University of Peace. So thank you, Ramu, thank you, panelists, and thank you all for joining us for this timely conversation. Ramu, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Joel, and welcome all of you joining online or in person, particularly the Ethics Fellows. As Joel mentioned, today is World Refugee Day, and in less than a week from now, next Tuesday, I believe, will be United Nations Charter Day, the anniversary of the signing of the UN Charter. And when you think of the Charter, you'll find how, in a sense, inherently contradictory it was, because it spoke primarily about the right and the sovereignty of states. But then it had this beautiful phrase buried within about the dignity and worth of the human person. And ever since then, the United Nations has been trying to match those two, the inviolability of nation states and the power and the dignity of the individual. And that's been done through a series of instruments, including the Refugee Convention of 1951, creating organizations such as the International Organization of Migration, which Barbara represents, or creating forums where the worth of the person can be linked to the worth of people in similar circumstances. One of the most recent being the Small Island Developing States forums, which Ambassador Mohamed has been an active participant in. So today we'll be looking at what, as Joel mentioned, is unlocking that cooperation. And I recall, Joel, how some years ago when you were speaking at Dartmouth, you made reference to a lake in Massachusetts called Chowbunagongakong, if I'm not mistaken. And what that meant was, the translation of that Native American phrase, I will fish on my side, you will fish on your side, no one will fish in the middle. That is the locking that we are trying to unlock. And when you talk of mobile people, whether involuntarily mobile, as refugees are, because historically of persecution or fear, but now also because of something which was not anticipated in 1951, the air we breathe, the sun under which we seek salvation, the climate. And we also see in that area of lack of cooperation the very perils that the United Nations anticipated in 1945 when it drew up that charter. The idea that states are inviolate, but human beings are even more so. So in that overall context, I'd like to begin our conversation today by asking each of our three distinguished panelists one very simple question. When did you first hear of refugees? In what context, in what circumstance? And how did that first hearing mold your attitude towards them? Maybe, Scott, I could begin with you.
Sure. So, Ramu, first of all, thank you very much, and thank you to the Carnegie Council for inviting us, especially on World Refugee Day. We appreciate it. You posed this question a few days ago, and I've racked my brain, and I haven't been able to pinpoint the precise moment when I heard the word refugee. But what I did realize is that when I learned about the word refugee, I realized at that time that my grandmother was a refugee, but I hadn't known that before because I didn't know what that meant. She never talked about it, but she did talk about coming to the US as a child. She talked about only being able to bring as many things as the family could carry. Wasn't clear if it was because of poverty or because of they're in a rush for some reason. But when I got older, I started to ask questions, and I learned about the term refugee at some point in there. And I asked questions, and I found out that they were actually fleeing persecution. And so she was a refugee before the 1951 convention, but she was a refugee, but she never thought of herself that way. She was as American as can be. But I don't know if that influenced my career choice, but it definitely influenced the way that I think about refugees. First of all, it made me realize that it could happen to any of us. And secondly, it made me realize that all refugees need, refugees are not, they're not passive recipients of aid. They're not helpless people waiting to get assistance. They're strong and resilient people, but they need safety and they need just a bit of support. And then like her, they can thrive and they can contribute to their communities. So I've always tried in my career to promote that perspective. I think that it changes the whole approach to humanitarian action for refugees. And I'm sure in some way her story is what kind of inspired that.
Thank you. Thank you. Ali?
Right. Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you, Carnegie Council, for inviting me to have this discussion this evening. The first time I heard the word refugee, I think it was about 1982. I was a 12-year-old schoolboy at the time. living in a very small island in the Maldives, in the south of the Maldives. We heard in the news about the Sabra and Shatila massacre in Lebanon. And that was when it was covered in the news in the Maldives, as well as we were listening to BBC radio from pocket radios. At that time, it was the word refugee were used, but I didn't know what refugee meant. But what struck me was that the number of casualties, number of victims, were more than the entire population of an island in the Maldives. The average population size in the Maldives Islands at that time was between 500 to 600. But the massacre at that time was about 2,000, I think. So the talk among the students in the school was that this is like, the entire population of an island in the Maldives had gone, even more than the entire population of the island, of an island in the Maldives had been massacred at that time, and they were called refugees. And it wasn't until I actually joined the foreign service a few years later, some years later, that refugees, the concept of refugees came into discussion in any meaningful way to me. But Maldives, of course, being isolated, geographically isolated in South Asia, we have no proximate experience in dealing with refugees.
Thank you. Barbara?
Thank you so much, Ramu, and thank you to the Carnegie Council for inviting IOM to be part of this discussion, especially on World Refugee Day. I think this is a really good time to reflect on how the conversation around people on the move has evolved. When it comes to my experience, it started pretty early as well. I am from Southern Africa, I'm from Zambia, and I moved to Ethiopia because my mother worked for an international organization. And so around age 10 or 11, I believe, I realized in the church that we attended that there were a group of people who needed support from the church community. And I heard friends and family speaking about these individuals as people who had fled southern Sudan. And I didn't understand the word refugee at the time, but I understood very clearly that these were people who had left their homeland, forcibly left their homeland. So growing up in Ethiopia was a great experience for me because I was exposed to different cultures from Africa and other parts of the world, but also exposed to the human mobility phenomenon, and I was part of that. My family voluntarily moved because of my mother's work to Ethiopia, but then I also understood that there were people who were forced to move. That has significantly shaped the career that I've developed. I went ahead and did a PhD looking at forced migration and the meaning of home, so maybe some issues there that I need to deal with. So looking at the meaning of home and what it means to be in a place that's not, from sort of the ancestral land, what that means. And then ending up working for IOM, also looking at questions of human mobility, the drivers and the pull factors and the push factors that allow people to move. And how can we make sure that the movement is voluntary and that those who receive the people that move are receptive as opposed to it being forced. So that's really my trajectory getting to this point. Thank you.
Thank you. So you've got fascinating perspectives here. As Scott said, it could happen to any of us. And I think, Ambassador, you put it really in very sharp context when you spoke about the equality, if you will, in size between a refugee population in one camp and that of the immediate neighborhood of the island in the Maldives, where people were listening to this. And then I think, Barbara, we often think about the pull factor when it comes to migration because people are attracted by the opportunity of a better life, a safer life, a more remunerative life. But there is also the push factor where people are driven to make these choices. I wanted to place our conversation also in the context of the Summit of the Future, which the United Nations will be hosting in, I think, exactly 3 months from now, in the last week of September. And there's been a great deal of discussion on this, but I wondered if you take a telescopic view, if you will, of the future, where do we see refugees, migrants, and also, in a sense, the globally mobile in that context, and how is it going to impact the world that we live in particular from the climate dimension? So maybe I could begin with that. Would you wish to hazard a guess on that, Ali?
Sure. I think, and I speak from the perspective of, first of all, from the Maldives perspective, and also more broadly from the perspective of small island developing states. And small island developing states with the acronym SIDS. We are very closely associated with the phenomena of climate change, in particular sea level rise. And sea level rise, climate change, sea level rise, and human mobility. These are associated terms that are used quite frequently. We understand now from scientific estimates that by 2050, about 1 billion people will be left homeless as a result of climate change, in particular sea level rise. And if sea level rise were to continue in the same trajectory as it is now, by end of the century, by 2100, the rise would be about 1 meter. And that would be bad news for SIDS, and that would be bad news for the Maldives as well. The Maldives' average elevation is about 1.5 meters above sea level. But I can speak for the Maldives, and Maldivians don't want to be climate refugees. We refuse to leave our home. Sea level rise is a slow onset event, and building adaptation to that is difficult, challenging, because it's a slow onset event. If it is a sudden onset event, then that's how we are wired, that we react to sudden events. But slow onset events are so challenging to respond to. But also climate change and sea level rise do manifest itself at times with sudden onset events, like the storm surges we experienced in the Maldives way back in 1987. And immediately after that, what we did was we started constructing a seawall around the capital, Male, which took about 15 years to complete. And the seawall is about 15 feet high. And that was the adaptation pathway that we chose. We started that in 1987, and we continued with that. So now, as a result of initial investment we made, key infrastructure in the Maldives are protected by these type of investments. And we are also ensuring that our adaptation includes protecting key population centers, key infrastructures such as airports and ports, and also the building codes in the country take into consideration the rapid changes in the climate that will impact countries such as Maldives. So we are going nowhere. We don't want to be climate refugees, but it doesn't mean that we will not talk about climate refugees. Indeed, we have to talk about it. We have to talk about it because it's a global phenomenon in which countries do experience that, and communities in various parts of the world are experiencing that, and they are driven, they are forced to leave their homes as a result of climate change. So unlocking international cooperation, I like the word unlocking because it is currently locked. And it requires a lot of diplomatic effort in order to unlock it. And how we can do it, first of all, it is doable, it is possible, but it's difficult. But if we take an inclusive, participatory manner to start the conversation, bring in those people who are actually impacted by the phenomenon of climate change, starting that conversation with from grassroots level onwards, we believe that we will be able to address the key challenges that we are facing in forging international cooperation to address this issue.
It's very powerfully put. In fact, I think at the SIDS conference, the Vice Chancellor of the University of West Indies, Hilary Beckles, made a reference to how adamant the small island states are. They tell the mighty ocean, if you want to pass, go around. Don't cut short through us. So thank you for bringing that in. Scott, the issues we are discussing now and the Summit of the Future, UNHCR, and the issues you deal with?
Well, I think it's important to begin by understanding the scale of the displacement crisis. So I'm going to maybe bombard you with some numbers, and I apologize for that in advance. But currently there's 120 million refugees and internally displaced people, IDPs. That's 120 million people who have fled their countries because of, or within their countries, because of conflict and persecution and violence. If that were a country of its own, that would be the 12th largest country in the world. That's about the size of Japan. So we're talking about a massive situation, and it requires multilateral cooperation and engagement in order to solve a problem like this. I shouldn't say a problem, I should say an issue like this, because these are human beings, and we need to always remember and not see it as a problem. But this is the highest number there's ever been in terms of recorded refugee and IDP populations. And what a lot of people don't realize, particularly in the West, is that 75% of them are living in low and middle income countries. And those low and middle income countries are dealing with their own challenges, but at the same time are providing protection to people who are displaced, who need it. And so there is a responsibility, I think, for other countries in the world to see and to support and to share that responsibility with them. More and more, what we're also seeing, and this is a challenge that the low and middle income countries face, is the impact of climate change on top of that. And climate change affects all of us, but it has a particular impact on the forcibly displaced populations. It impacts them, as I think Joel said in his introduction, throughout the cycle of displacement, prior to them leaving, after they have become displaced. So again, a few numbers. 84% of all refugees, again, who have fled for conflict, violence, and persecution reasons, are living in countries that are highly vulnerable to climate change, to the impacts of climate change. And 75% of all refugees and IDPs in the world are living in countries that are also highly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And in that case, they're often living in areas that are environmentally degraded already, or in areas where climate shocks are more prevalent, or both in the worst case. And 50% of all refugees and IDPs are living in places where they're exposed to both climate and conflict. So they've escaped a conflict, ended up seeking safety in a place where there's a conflict also ongoing, with climate impacts on top of that. And so of course there's a possibility again for people to continue moving. And it may sound cynical, but to the West, it's also important for them to understand that if they're going to support people where they are, they need to do something about supporting them now, because they'll continue to move because the situation is not getting better. And then in terms of return, in 2022, 90% of the refugees who said that they want to return would have to return to a place where it's also severely impacted by climate, meaning that it's also a difficult, durable solution to find for them. So it's really changed the way that we work, and we have a long way to go, but I think it needs to be also something that the whole international community rallies behind. One thing I'll just highlight quickly is we are working on predictive analytics and foresight. So what we're trying to do is to identify where are the intersections between conflict, displacement, and the impacts of climate change. And we did a first pilot in the Sahel where we brought together academic institutions, NGOs, and the UN. And we gathered historical data for analysis related to food security, conflict, and climate. And when it's climate, it's things related to historical droughts, floods, heat, etc., as well as displacement patterns. And then the researchers that we worked with were able to then identify these, what we called vulnerability hotspots, places within the Sahel where those factors, those vulnerability factors all converge, and where they have already caused displacement. And then the researchers have been able to project into the future where further displacement will happen, and even, to the extent it's possible, the scale of that displacement. In the meantime, we've started as the UN to use this information for our own planning in terms of development, disaster risk reduction, et cetera, and also governments in the region. And so it's important for the planning purpose, but it's also very important because it starts to build an evidence base, which we can then use to, let's say, convince donors and international financial institutions to direct climate financing to fragile and conflict-affected areas, which are far, far underserved in terms of climate finance. I have much more to get into in terms of UNHCR's work, but I think I'll leave it there for now, and we'll get to that during the next question.
No, thank you. And I think I was really struck by the human story behind those percentages and statistics, which seems to suggest that countries and populations which themselves are in precarious straits or in dire situations are the most welcoming when it comes to absorbing refugee populations because of climate change. In fact, very vividly in an article which Barbara wrote, where she spoke about this town, Nyala, in Sudan, which received so many displaced persons from Darfur that its population trebled, and yet they soldiered on. They were willing to absorb what, with all respect, many affluent countries and communities in the world would not have been able to. So, Barbara, what is your perspective on this and the Summit of the Future?
Yeah, no, thank you for that question. I think from IOM's perspective, going back to the sort of what you spoke about originally, the IOM joining the UN in 2016, and then 2018, we saw the Global Compact for Migration really enabled us to really be part of the UN family, but also the UN discussions, and also be able to sort of socialize a lot of our migration work, human mobility expertise. So some of the things that we have been doing recently, especially as it relates to climate change and human mobility, is really talking about the work that we're doing in the Sahel. That's what I would like to focus on today. The work that we've done in the Sahel, and by the way, it's Sahel and East Africa, so we've got some work that's ongoing in the same sort of work being done in Somalia as well. And this is work that is related to farmer-herder conflict, focusing on transhumance conflict. So transhumance being a livelihood sort of process, a seasonal migration where herders move seasonally based on a calendar. And traditionally, we've known that when herders move, they often go to sedentary communities where their cattle grazes on land, and in return, their cattle provides manure for for the land. And so it's been somewhat of a symbiotic relationship. And we've noticed over the last few years an increase in intercommunal conflicts when seasonal migrants are moving and then reaching farmers or other sedentary communities and having clashes and really deadly conflicts. IOM has traditionally been an organization that has supported in terms of data, providing data. We map out the flows of migration. We map out displacement flows and things of that sort. And we're able to provide that to the UN and others to be able to understand exactly how migration is happening. And we use that data in order to have tailored and appropriate humanitarian and peace-building support. So what we started doing is using that migration monitoring pattern to sort of monitor to monitor the flow of transhumance herders. So what we're trying to do is understand how exactly these herders are moving, when are they moving, so that we can perhaps anticipate when they will reach a sedentary community so that we can prevent conflict. And what we noticed was that they were moving outside of the seasonal calendar. And why is that? Rains were shorter. Droughts are happening. And then the other thing that we're noticing is that they're moving not using the predetermined corridors, because they're transhumance corridors that they've agreed to use. They're using other corridors because the other corridors are no longer they're not able to use them because of environmental degradation and that sort of thing, so they're using different corridors. So what happens is that the receiving communities, the sedentary communities, are not ready for them because they're moving too early, or they're using a route, so the people that they're going to meet along that route are not ready for them, and clashes happen. And this is, for us, this has been very important and very important work for us because we're using our migration monitoring tools to anticipate and understand when conflict can happen and what are the triggers. Now, of course, climate change, or the consequences, we'll say the consequences of climate change, are determining human behavior. These herders are making a decision to move early or to move in a different way because of how they're reacting to how climate change is impacting their livelihood. But that's not the only thing, of course, and I think we need to nuance this. That's not the only thing that has led to clashes. I think we always say the consequences of climate change as opposed to saying climate change leads to conflict, right? It's the consequences of climate change that are doing this, and we need to think about those things very carefully. And the other thing is that the Sahel in particular, as well as in East Africa, we're working in an environment and spaces that are already fraught with drivers of conflict. These are spaces where there's lack of state authority or presence of lack of state capacity and authority, lack of basic services. So there are already frustrations happening. These are spaces where there's a proliferation of arms in circulation. And these are also spaces where violent extremist groups are operating. So you're already working in an environment that is fraught with these challenges. And so when these individuals then link up, these groups, herders and farmers link up, we're finding out that they're having conflicts and using armed weapons, for example. Or they're using arms, for example. So I think this has been something that we've been tracking and trying to understand. And I'll wrap up here just really quickly, just to give you a little bit of the mechanics of how this works. We are an organization that works at the very local level. We work with communities, and we ensure that everything that we do is within the communities, informed by communities, using a community-based approach. So what we do is we work with a network of herders, and they are our counterparts, or we're their counterparts in this effort. And when they notice that a herd is coming too soon, or it's too large, or it's used a different route, immediately a conflict resolution mechanisms are activated. And these are endogenous conflict resolution mechanisms, of course, that are within the communities, to bring communities together, to enable them to resolve the conflicts together, and perhaps even go a step further in many instances, come up with a resource management plan. How are we going to share this land or work with the two groups that need to use this land, with the herders and the farmers? How are we going to share this water source, for example? So those are some of the things that we've been looking at, using our tools that have enabled us for many years now to monitor how movement is happening, whether it's forced, whether it's voluntary. But this one is very interesting because we're starting to see the interlinkages between the consequences of climate change that I would say, and human mobility.
That's beautifully put, and I think, especially for someone who's been fortunate to work with the United Nations for a number of years, it's very moving to realize that we often have this phrase about think global and act local. But what you're saying is really a reverse of that. What is happening is that by thinking at the local level and working in the communities that you mentioned, you are able to act global through what the United Nations is trying to do in terms of the goals it determines, in terms of the Pact for the Future that it's working on now. So thank you. I'd like to, in this last round between us, ask each of you to reflect on one or two points that the other two speakers made, which have triggered something in your mind. You might agree with it, you might disagree with it, but it's a fresh thought that's come to you. Anything at all in the course of this conversation. May I ask you to begin, Ali?
Sure. I think from the discussion we heard from our two fellow panelists is that the need to tailor responses locally and responses that would suit the situation that exists at local level. Responses to climate change, especially in the case of SIDS, especially on sea level rise or sudden storms that would come and destroy the infrastructure in the islands, is radically different from, for example, the situation in Sahel. In cases of SIDS, we are worried with the land, in the case of the Maldives, the land is just 1% of the Maldives is just 1%, 99% is water. That small fraction of land, we are worried that it might get lost because of land erosion or coastal erosion. So protecting that land is the number one priority. And similarly, protecting the critical infrastructure from storm surges, from, in the case of the Caribbean, is hurricanes. Similarly, in the Pacific is again storms and hurricanes. In the case of the Maldives is storm surges that would come every now and then. These are local level solutions that need to be attended to and responded and designed. And that's our adaptation. That's how the adaptation policies are shaped and driven. And that's how local population also respond to that. And that, I think the need, when we think of climate change or response to climate change and human mobility at global level, the discussion has to be, first of all, recognizing the differences that exist in various parts of the world depending on where you are located. And that's I think, what I could take from your presentation there.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Barbara?
I think both have said some really interesting things that resonate with the work that we do at IOM. I think in your presentation, Ambassador, you were speaking about taking an inclusive and participatory approach, and I think that's very important. For us at IOM, the work that we do, I mentioned this, the community-based planning, it's so critical to find those solutions from the people that are actually experiencing them. I think we all know this at this point where endogenous solutions are the way to go. They know what they need, and there's such a wealth of knowledge about solutions there, and I think that's very critical. And I think it's interesting to see that that's definitely applied in every context that has a human mobility dimension to it. And I think what's important about what Scott was saying about the anticipatory work, it's definitely difficult trying to predict. We have a hard time also, trying to use the data to tell us exactly where things will happen. But it is important because the name of the game, especially for the work that I do, which is more related to peace building. Prevention really is the name of the game, and this adaptation, prevention, and whatever tools that we can bring and putting them together in order to figure out ways that we can prevent some of these challenges that are being faced. I think that's really critical. So I think that there's definitely a lot of complementarity in that regard.
Wonderful. Scott.
Well, I'm pleased to say that we're all in agreement, because I was actually thinking the same thing that Barbara mentioned, particularly about what the ambassador said. The grassroots approach that you described for solutions, and the participatory approach to be sure that all elements of the community are able to contribute to first to identifying the problem, and then to developing and implementing a solution, and also reporting back to us later and telling us how those solutions worked out and how they can be adjusted in the future is critical. And in UNHCR, we have for a long time been carrying out annual participation exercises where we pull together different segments of the community, whether it's divided by age or by gender or by different diversity groups. And we sit with them for days on end and identify the specific problems they have, and then sit with them to work on developing solutions together, to co-developing these solutions. And I'm pleased to hear also that in the Maldives and IOM feels that that's also a critical approach. And then just quickly also on the transhumance work that Barbara's team is working on, it's really impressive to think about the ability to not just what we are doing is predicting the future displacement, but to be able to eventually predict the routes that people are traveling and the potential flashpoints means that you can then also theoretically, I would say, send people in to mediate prior to any conflicts arising. And I think that the United Nations puts a lot of emphasis on prevention, but I don't see that we've had a huge amount of success. But I think on the more local level, UNHCR does a lot of work on peaceful coexistence between communities. And that's very successful. But I think the ideas that Barbara mentioned about actually preventing conflict between groups that are moving, or between them and those who are staying, that are farmers, is really critical and something that should be built upon.
Thank you for that. Thank you. I think at this point we'll widen the conversation. And if any of you have a point to make or a question to ask, my only request is, when you put your question, please stand up so that you're in full form on our webcast. Please, sir, rise.
Hi, everyone. Travis Godado. I'm also a member of the Carnegie Ethics Fellowship. So on behalf of the whole group, thank you for your time. I want to go back to a question you raised at the very beginning, Ramu, which, if I may, I thought was really interesting, which is, what did you all first think when you heard the word refugee for the first time? And I think it's interesting because often we get bogged down in these semantic quibbles in policy and other walks of life, and we want to try to discredit them. But I think there's something to be said for the importance of words and how they're used. And I was listening intensely to what you all were saying, and you would use phrases like displaced persons, or you would modify refugee to talk about climate refugees. And so I guess the question I have is, do we think that the word refugee still has salience today? Do we think that it encapsulates all of the nuance that comes with displaced persons? And I think thinking strategically about how we might be able to advocate in a policy setting, have you found that in your advocacy that there are actually more useful phrases to use to advance the discourse in a way that's actually advantageous to the cause of displaced persons, of forced migrants, and the like? So thank you again for your time.
Thank you. Who'd like to take that on, please?
Well, sure, I would like to take that on. Absolutely, I think that the term refugee is still relevant and has meaning. But I think very often, one thing that we could probably do better is to explain what that means in the kind of terminology that's easily understandable outside of our circle. When we were talking and we were using the term refugee, and then later talking about forcibly displaced or talking about internally displaced. It's maybe an overly legalistic way of speaking for the general public, but it's a very important distinction between all of those. As you know, and as Ramu mentioned at the beginning, the 1951 convention is clear on who is a refugee and who is not a refugee. That's not to say that other people that fall out of that definition don't have human rights and that we shouldn't be doing things to support them. But the term refugee is actually critical to the rights of those people who most need it. If we start to weaken the term, if we water the term down, it ends up actually having real life and death consequences for people. The main benefit that a person who is a refugee has is they can't be sent back home to the place where they would face torture or other human rights violations, persecution, etc. And that's what we want to be sure that we don't lose.
Please.
My name is Caitlin Sussman. This question can be answered by anyone, but it's particularly in response to something the ambassador said. So I just want to go back to what you said about how people in the Maldives don't necessarily want to become climate refugees. I don't think that anybody does, but still there's a need to find some way to protect them in the event that they are displaced. So I'm wondering, there have been solutions proposed like climate humanitarian visas to protect people from the Pacific Islands, for example. New Zealand tried this. It was scrapped because specifically for that reason, the people who would be affected did not want to recognize that they would be potentially climate refugees. So I'm wondering, do you see a role for solutions like climate humanitarian visas as a solution? And if so, how can national governments work to implement these visas in a way that is acceptable and in conjunction with the people most affected?
Thank you. That question is quite topical at the moment because at the moment within the UN system there are discussions about sea level rise, and in September we will have a high-level meeting in the General Assembly on the question of sea level rise. So at the moment discussions are going on within the UN system on some of the key points that you highlighted in your question, some of the solutions. And within, while discussing this topic, issues of sensitive nature to some countries come to the surface. So again, unlocking cooperation is what is being required. I think issuing different types of visa, whether it's climate refugees visa or climate related visa, in whatever name that is being used, is a response. What we are interested right now is prevention. We still have time. In the case of small island developing states, we do have time because the very nature of sea level rise is as a slow onset process or slow onset event, that we can implement measures to adapt to climate change, to adapt to sea level rise. We have the solutions, we have the blueprints. What is required, what is missing is the required level of funding or the technology coming from mainly the countries that actually got rich by emitting greenhouse gases. Those countries need to compensate the countries that are suffering or that will suffer as a result of GHGs. And that is the missing link. Issuing different types of visa as a response, we of course need to find a solution to that. We need to have a global level consensus on that. But most important as a solution is prevention. Prevention is possible, doable, viable. What is missing is funding.
Please.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all the panelists. I'm George Commander, also a member of the Carnegie Ethics Fellow and a diplomat at the UN. My question is trying to connect the dots on the nexus between climate migration and international humanitarian law, because I believe my colleague asked about the salience of the word refugee. And I believe the next question that followed that also talked about creating that humanitarian access or visa or things like that. So my question is, at a time when international humanitarian law principles have been really challenged, to use a diplomatic word, to say, what role do you see its principles, in harnessing or in streamlining some of these solutions that we're putting forward to help the issue of displacement or climate migrant and the like? Because I believe some of the resistance that have been, that have been somewhat of a pushback is because sometimes refugees or climate refugees feel like they might be neglected along the way. So that fear, that feeling, and all that ties into some of the values and the principles that international international organizations such as the UN, IOM, have really been working in trying to harness that cooperation. So in essence, what role or how can international humanitarian law principles be really utilized in the prevention policies or the solutions or the streamlining of these situations? Thank you.
Barbara, would you like to?
That's a tough one, but it's definitely a good question. I think that there is definitely a conversation to be had regarding international humanitarian law and the principles that go along with it, and how to sort of address the question of refugees, because fundamentally it is most of the times it is a humanitarian issue, but it can be dealt with at different angles as well. And I think the nexus that we look at is that it's not one or the other. There's definitely a humanitarian aspect, and I think maybe Scott would be much better placed to speak about that. But from where I sit, I look at it from sort of the nexus with the peace building angle as well. So I think that it's not just a question of this being a humanitarian question. It's a peace building question. It's also a development related question. And when you look at that thread, it shouldn't be looked at in isolation, and these are conversations we're having constantly within the UN. It's not easy. It's not easy to do the nexus, right? It's not. We talk about the nexus all the time, but it's not an easy thing. But we need to figure out how to work from a humanitarian lens. How do we apply humanitarian principles and humanitarian approaches? How do you bring in what was often called the missing middle, which is really the peace building, which is really more middle term, and then you lay the groundwork to make sure that what you started from the humanitarian lens to the peace building lens actually lays the foundation and makes it conducive for us to go into long-term development. So I think for me, where I sit being in the middle, I always say we shouldn't compartmentalize, but it's actually seeing the stream, how it goes from one end to the other. Because at one point, we need to move away from the humanitarian. We need to get to development so that people are thriving and they're not stuck in a humanitarian situation. And making sure that those links are made, it's not easy, but it's definitely a conversation that's being had and something that we're working on continuously within the UN system.
I won't speak directly to international humanitarian law, but maybe just to build on the point that you made, that some people feel like maybe they're falling through the cracks in terms of people who are fleeing for reasons related to climate or the impact of climate. So under international refugee law, people who are fleeing, so I'm going to set out a few categories, although I know you said you don't like to compartmentalize. People who are fleeing as a result of conflict that has a direct link to climate. For example, the conflict between Sudan and South Sudan, where control over natural resources and arable land was actually an objective of the warring parties. They fled maybe because of something more, in their minds, more related to climate. But in fact, we would say that they would have a claim under the convention. There's other groups that would have fled, they also would have a claim under the convention. If they're if there are journalists that are talking about violations of international law related to the environment, and they're being persecuted for that. But then if we get a couple steps further to maybe catch some of the people that you're talking about who are falling into the cracks. So within Africa and within Latin America, there's the OAU Convention and the Cartagena Declaration, both of which expand the refugee definition from the 1951 Convention. And they expand it to people who are fleeing because of disturbance of public order. And there's research being undertaken now to see how far that can go. Can the result of a hurricane be considered disturbance of the public order? And in that case, in those two continents, those people would then also be considered refugees. And then there's another group that we can talk about that might not fit under both of those, which are people who, if they flee, but they were forcibly returned, would face human rights violations, not the same as under the 1951 Convention, but under international human rights law. So countries would be prohibited from returning them. And there's a Human Rights Committee decision that said that potentially in places, for example, where sea level rise makes the land inhospitable and unlivable, you wouldn't be able to send somebody back to those places. And then I guess the last group maybe, then there's the humanitarian, you mentioned like a humanitarian visa. So some countries have decided, Argentina being one, that they've adopted a humanitarian entry program, a temporary protection program, which is sort of in case of mass influx, in case there's many people coming and you can't determine which one might qualify and which one won't. If it's due to climate-related disaster as it's defined under their law, they would have a temporary protection status. And then the last group is the ones that I mentioned before. If they don't fall under any of those, if they're migrants, and very often they're all moving together, some of them are migrants, some are refugees, some fall under the other categories, they still have human rights that need to be protected along the route. And that's something that we as the United Nations all need to work together as they're moving to ensure that they're respected.
Thank you. Maybe any last thoughts, Ambassador?
Right. I would say that the larger question of human mobility and climate change as a cause of human mobility requires solution urgently, because the global system that we are talking about, whether it is 1951 Convention, Refugees Convention, or the more recent discussions that we have had, are all dated. It requires solutions that are shaped by taking the current developments into account. And most importantly, it requires the inputs of the people who are actually experiencing the negative impact of climate change. And their views need to be taken on board. 1951 Convention was negotiated at a time when most of these countries were not even nation states. They were under colonial rule at that time. And we never had climate change coming into the negotiating room at that time. So whether it is adaptation, whether it is response to climate change through various policy instruments that need to take into account the views and the experiences of those who are living through the impact of climate change. That's what I would like to add as a last thought.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And as Kevin mentioned, those of you who are fortunate to be actually with us will have a chance to continue the conversation upstairs when we go there from here. I'd like to thank all of you for coming to this forum, and those of you who've joined us online, and many more who will be watching a webcast of this at their own convenience. And of course, I think on behalf of all of us at the podium, thanks to the Carnegie Council, to Joel, to Kevin, and to everyone who made this possible as we continue to unlock cooperation. Thank you.